stuttering. Now, we find that very often about 25% of preschool children actually have those typical dysfluencies. And to be honest, we all have typical dysfluencies. Even I hesitated there when I was talking there for a second. So we know that, and especially when adults do public speaking, we know what that feels like when you feel like you're stuttering. We have those kind of normal dysfluencies. Now, what are normal dysfluencies? Now, when we think about the type of speech errors you make when you have a normal dysfluency, it might be a phrase repetition, like I just did there, or it can be a whole word. So you can say something like my mommy. Yeah, so that is a whole word repetition. A part word repetition is when we say something like butterfly. Now you'll notice there's not a lot of tension in that. It's just the repetition of the word. So that's quite typical in typical dysfluency. Then what we might see is a pause or a hesitation when you're thinking about what you're going to say. And the reason why we often find this in preschool children is because there are so much language processing going on for them. Their language progression have gone so fast that sometimes it gets a little bit discombobulated and they're trying to figure it all out, or they're thinking of all these words to try and say it. So sometimes we also find that they might revise something that they said. Oh, I saw mummy. I saw an elephant going down the road. So there's that revision there. So those are all kind of typical dysfluencies. Now, sometimes 1 out of 20 kids who have those dysfluencies will develop an abnormal stutter. So what kind of danger signs do we need to look out for? And what kind of risk factors do we need to keep in mind so that we know that a preschool child will probably be more at risk to develop a stutter, and we probably will have to intervene sooner rather than later. So sometimes just some general supporting tips will help, and other times you will need to, if those danger factors or the risk factors come into play, then it's best to intervene just, to be safe rather than sorry. So the danger signs that we need to look out for is not necessarily the amount of repetitions that or amount of dysfluencies a child might be using. It's more about how severe they are when they do happen. So it's not about do they have 50 word repetitions or part word repetitions. It's about when they do have that dysfluency or that stutter, how severe does it come across? Is there a lot of tension? So do they get stuck? And we can even see on their face that things are changing. There's some associated motor behaviors like eye blinking or twitching, or even just what they call articulatory posturing, where your mouth is kind of trying to get that word out. So that's a danger sign. We also don't want to see multiple part word repetitions. So if we see butterfly and elephant, we want to kind of look out for those because you don't want too many part word repetitions. Whole word repetitions generally is okay, but part word ones we need to look out for. We also don't want to see a prolongation. Okay, so when you say sound and you stretch it out a little bit, that's usually a danger sign that it's more kind of a stuttering behavior rather than a typical dysfluency. You also want to watch out for the sound that sometimes come in. Other than just somebody hesitating, going you don't want that sound everywhere scattered throughout when you're speaking and when you're doing this. You see a lot of that in stuttering behavior. We call that a schwa vowel. So we want that sound is called a schwa. Then any kind of struggle or tension, like I was saying before, if you are going to hear that repetition, if you see there's any kind of neck tension or tension in the jaw or any kind of facial tension where it looks like it's really hard to get that sound out sometimes, we want to also watch for changes in pitch and loudness. So whether it goes high or low or loud bursts, but that changes quite a lot. We just want to listen out to those because that's a little danger sign to keep in mind. You want to also keep an eye for avoidance. Now, avoidance to talk in general, maybe, but also maybe avoidance using specific words that they know they might get stuck on. Sometimes when I ask 7-year-olds how do they feel about where they are talking, and are there certain words that they get stuck on more often than not, sometimes it'll be a word like daddy, or it could be their own name. Because their own name has maybe got a p or a b in it, or an m, or some sound that's usually a trigger for them. And they'll find that they're avoiding using that specific word, or even avoiding in general to talk. If we see any moment of fear as the child is talking, as if they can't control their speech, and we can see that, oh no, I'm not getting this out, that's a danger sign that we need to move on, okay? Because kids who are typically dysfluent don't even sometimes notice when it's happening because it's relatively smooth. Kids who have that moment of fear, they're kind of showing us there's something else going on here that they might need help with. Also, if you see any kind of tremor or hear a tremor, so if it's a tremor in the voice, or when we see a tremor in the lips, or in any other part of when somebody is speaking, we want to keep an eye on that as well, because that's another danger sign. We also want to, any disruption of airflow or voicing, we want to keep an eye on that. It needs to be relatively smooth and flow, not blocked like, and then the airflow gets blocked off like that. So that's what we kind of want to watch out for, is the silent tensions and blocks. So what kind of risk factors are out there? What do we know about research and stuttering that shows us that for some kids, they're more at risk than others? Firstly, if a child has a family history of stuttering, they're more at risk. If a child is male and of male gender, they're also more at risk. And research has also shown us if we have a boy whose dad stutters, he is 5 times more likely to also stutter. So that's why we need to keep in mind those risk factors as well. Girls tend to have an easier time kind of spontaneously recovering the stuttering too. It doesn't mean girls don't stutter, but it's more often than not boys. If a child has another speech and language disorder, that often puts them at risk for stuttering too, because even trying to say the speech sounds, they're often more aware. And we do find that kids who have word finding difficulties don't just have difficulty thinking of the word, but sometimes might have stuttering along with that. It's not always the case, but they're just more at risk. Or a kid who has speech sound difficulties, like a phonological difficulty, where they have those speech errors already, they're usually more at risk to stutter later on. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Also, what I found that we often see in children when they are dysfluent, we need to kind of keep in mind what we call the demand capacity model. So what we mean by that is sometimes when the demand for fluency goes up, and the child's ability to cognitively cope linguistically, so their language processing, emotionally, all of those motor wise, if they have the skills for something, when they have difficulty coping with the demand, and they're put under more pressure with all those other factors. So let's say they're having a really hard day, they're upset about something, and the demand goes up, we find that their fluency goes down. Okay, so their capacity for fluency goes down. When they're having a really good day and things are going much better, we find that their fluency goes up. So when a kid comes in to me for therapy and we're talking about stuttering and how things have been going, very often a parent would say to me, well, last week didn't go so well because there was a lot more going on for him. He was upset about something that happened in school and that triggered an episode. So sometimes it's that, or sometimes there was a lot of social events on, so there was a lot more demand on talking. So we find that the fluency went down a bit because the demand went up. So that changes over time, and especially changes when they're transitioning from one setting to another. So let's say they're moving from preschool to school setting, or you're moving house, or anything changes in that child's life that can trigger that because of the demand capacity model changing for that child. So it sometimes just makes it easy for us to understand, well, now why are they stuttering more now than they usually do? It's usually because that demand has changed. So if we think about looking at that, how can we think about how that might change and how we might talk to a child about that as well? Now, I might start with talking about the main tips. So I'm going to show them to you now. So what I want you to keep in mind is the first one, and probably the main key message, is that we need to listen patiently. We need to really focus on what the child is saying, and we need to really listen without interrupting and really encouraging turn taking. What we find very often when kids are dysfluent, it's much harder for them when somebody's interrupting them. You know yourself, when somebody interrupts you when you're speaking, it's very hard to keep your speech fluent because you're trying to get your message across. We often find that kids, when they get really excited or when they're upset, it's much harder. Again, their capacity is down, the demand goes up, so it's much harder for them to be fluent. It's much easier if you listen patiently, let them fish, and listen to their actual message, what they're saying, and not how they're saying it. So we're not listening to where they're getting stuck on their words. We're actually listening to what they're saying. Oh, you got really excited because there was a visitor at preschool, and the visitor was a magician and he did a magic trick. That's amazing. And listen to the full story. We often find that when we listen patiently, kids find it much easier to get the words out in general. We also want to not rush them while they're speaking. And when you're doing that, it's quite helpful to model slow speech yourself. When we look at how we're talking as adults, we often go super fast without really realizing what we're doing. And that means that a child speaks up as well. I often find kids who I see for therapy, mom or dad or somebody else in the family or all in the family, tend to speak rather fast. And tend to almost compete for turns in talking. So when we're talking about turn taking and not rushing, it might just be that something like a talking stick would be a good idea. So you can make anything a talking stick. You can even use like a fly swatter, but because it's such a cute looking one, it can be a nice kind of turn taking or a talking stick for a family to use. So you get your turn when you have the talking stick and nobody else interrupts when you have the talking stick. You can make a talking rock. You can use all kinds of things like that just to make it clear that everybody in the family get their turn and that you're really listening to their message of what they're saying and not necessarily how they're delivering it. Then what we want to do is also, for number 4, we want to really praise your child's talking without expecting fluency, even if they're coming for speech therapy. We want to really just focus on their talking and their message. So you could say something like, oh, it's so much fun talking with you, and I love what you're telling me. Rather than saying, oh, I heard you got stuck on that word or that. What you can also praise is when you see the strategies being used as they were practiced in the clinic. Usually we want a child to be completely fluent in the clinic setting and lots of circumstances before we start practicing in everyday settings. So when a child starts fluency therapy, if they do speech therapy and working on their stuttering, please don't expect fluent speech all the time, because they're still practicing just within the clinic setting. It takes quite a lot of practice, because we want to practice strategies that make them nice and fluid, but we also want to work on modifying that stuttering so kids don't get so fearful of it that they feel they have control over it, and they can even deliberately stutter and make themselves stutter, which means they're the ones in charge, because sometimes it feels so helpless when their bodies do something that they feel they have no control over. When we think about that part, it really makes it so much easier to think about praising the talking, really focusing on the message. Something else that's really important to do, and it's the last tip for today, is to talk to your child about stuttering. When we avoid talking about a specific topic, it really creates the impression that it's bad. It's so bad, people don't even want to talk about it, right? Because it's a big no-no. It's something that's so horrible, and it very often fills children with feelings of guilt and shame. And when you talk to them about how they feel about stuttering, and it has never been discussed openly at home, very often there's that feeling of, my parents don't even want to talk about it because it's so bad. They must think I'm a horrible kid, and they think my stuttering is awful, and it's the most horrible thing. So the best thing we can do is to talk about it. Yes, everybody gets a little bit stuck when they're talking, but it's more important about what they're saying and not how they're saying it. So that's something we need to really keep in mind when we think about that. And very often I find that kids who are dysfluent, who stutter, often have a sensitive temperament. And I learned this from my very good friend Patty Walton, who wrote the book Fun with Fluency, and from Fluency School Age Children. And she talked about kids with sensitive temperament. And we often find that kids who do stutter also have a sensitive temperament. I'm just going to show you this little picture that a boy drew for me when we were talking about his stuttering. And I was asking him about how he feels in his body. And we were talking about the butterflies he feels in his tummy when he's talking. And I asked him, what was his brain doing? And he said his brain was thinking about when he's reading, how the other kids will be laughing at him. But when I asked him if the children were really laughing at him, he said no. So he actually knew that they weren't laughing at them. He were actually thinking things like, oh, he's actually doing really good reading. So it's interesting how he thought that that experience of standing in front of a class and reading was so stressful that he could have inferred all kinds of negative things that the others would be thinking of him. And we often find that with adolescents, with adults who stutter, that they start to catastrophize the thinking, because that's what we all do as humans. We sometimes think, oh, they must think I'm horrible. It's like women think on the beach when they wear a bikini, it's like, oh, they must think I'm not in good shape. Or sometimes when the dads think about how their performance will be seen by other dads, we all as adults have that, and just as human beings have that particular characteristic where we infer what others might be thinking, but we're often wrong. And sometimes it's good to go and ask and check with the kids in the class and check with the teacher, how's the response actually? Is there a negative response to it? Because sometimes kids with sensitive temperament will pick up on maybe somebody laughing who might just be uncomfortable hearing somebody stutter, and they're laughing because they don't know what else to do. And it's not that they're laughing at them, but they don't know how to cope with it. Or maybe they're laughing because of something else that somebody else is doing. So it's really good to kind of think about that and talk about how they might be feeling and how has their day been when it's been about talking, and how their bodies are feeling and how their minds are feeling. If there's anything more you want to know about stuttering and difficulties that children might have around that, give us a shout.